And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rachel Snow. She's the branch chief of population and development in the technical division of the UN Population Fund Agency. And so Dr. Snow has been with the UN for 7 years, and she leads the fund's work on strengthening national level population data systems. So that's the high level. And then they focus also, use that demographic intelligence for inclusive development at the local level, or really from the ground up. And that is an incredible mission that they support. So Dr. Snow, she received her doctorate in population sciences from the Harvard School of Business Health and has held teaching positions at Harvard, University of Heidelberg, and the University of Michigan. We're excited to have her with us this morning to learn about how they're embracing location intelligence. And so if you just give me one moment, I'm going to switch over presenter to Dr. Rachel Snow. Dr. Snow, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Randall. Can you hear me just fine?
You're coming through live and clear.
Excellent. Okay, and thanks so much, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here today. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So the mission of the UN Population Fund, which should be familiar to many of you, is to promote universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. It's what we're known for. That mission is reflected in 3 big goals: ending maternal death in the world, ending the unmet need for family planning in the world, and ending harmful practices like child marriage or female genital cutting. But all of that work is guided by the big investments we make in governments all over the world to improve the quality and the scope of their population data. And much of that is focused on census, and to help governments use that census not only to generate a kind of demographic intelligence, but also then to track the SDGs, to track the progress that's being made in something like family planning or health services, find those people who are far behind, who are in remote settlements without access to services, and then to help target the investments accordingly. Likewise, to use that census data to know who is where when a humanitarian crisis hits, and hence the government is prepared and can respond more effectively. Why the big focus on census? In much of the developed world and the global north, we rely more and more on very routine registration data, birth registration, school registration. We integrate those data and we have them in a very timely fashion. But much of the low and middle income countries of the world still rely on that once a decade census as the foundational data for all decision making and planning. Now, including thinking about the Sustainable Development Goal indicators, almost half of them demand that a government has population data in order to measure those SDG indicators. In our support to governments, and in the last census round, that was 135 governments we worked with on census, what we find in this round still is that modern methods, the use of handheld devices that enable GIS, the geospatial transformation, we call it, in the census, is very, very much light and far behind. And much of that is linked to Jack's last point, that this is about human resources, institutional capacity, and where sometimes those data are indeed generated, often the shortfall is in how best to use those data for development. Now, the 2020 census round, often people are informed to think, okay, well, everybody runs their census in 2020. No, the census round is a 10-year period. It ran the 2020 census round from 2015, and it'll continue to 2024. But the bulk of countries, the overwhelming majority of countries, will host their census in either 2020 or 2021. Well, you can just imagine what's happened this round in light of COVID. So where 59 countries expected to run their census this year, 68 next year, of these 44 are in confirmed postponements, and many are in a holding pattern that's uncertain. You see the green are the few that had already accomplished it, but it's the red and the orange countries that had expected to run the census this year or next. Many of those are in a holding pattern. Our work in this round is to try and transform this census round to become really one that leverages the power of location. So it's been everything about modernizing the census in this round so that we see the majority of governments using handheld devices and increasing the use of GIS in their census for everything from planning to operations and towards analysis. So just to give a picture, in the 2010 round of census, while many developed countries in the global north used absolutely GIS and they had locations for their census, it was really only a scattering of the developing countries that used GIS in the 2010 round. Brazil, Senegal, Cape Verde, a few here and there, but this is the round where we think now the majority of governments across the world are in fact embracing GIS. And this is really a transformational moment for all of us in terms of the work that we're trying to do. For example, for census planning, GIS is extremely valuable. Where we have census tracts, what are often called enumeration areas, it's the number of households that an average census worker can go to and carry in coverage in a day. So an enumeration area here pictured in the Lusaka district, these have to be reviewed again. From the 2010 round, now looking at the households, how many of those have household numbers that have exploded, and we need to split that old enumeration area or census tract into 3 enumeration areas, and others where there may have been an exodus of families. And so those households fall below the threshold, and we should merge those enumeration areas. This is the kind of preparatory work that a lot of governments around the world are undertaking right now as they prepare for census. Likewise, GIS can really help us in the field work. This is an example from South Africa, and you see there what are, in fact, the actual real-time snapshot of enumeration workers out in the field. This enables them to find those locations easily. They know what are the coordinates for every household. But at the same time, the supervisors can actually validate the locations as the data is entered, and real-time corrections can take place, rapidly accelerating the extent to which time is required over many months to check the quality assurance of the census. This has all been accelerated given the new technology, handheld devices, and the potential to use GIS. In a somewhat more powerful example here, this is Afghanistan. And just to give an example, this is a country which hadn't run a census since 1979. Many decades of conflict and unsettlement. And the country was able to run the census in what you see as a sort of modeled parts of the country in the middle of the map. So a portion of the country could be enumerated. So once that was completed, however, it was really decided that the conflict and the risks were too great in all of the outer districts and provinces to actually conduct the census. And so working closely with World Pop and layering, using location as the great integrator, layering topography, settlement maps, night lights, and then based on the algorithms that could be generated from the census enumerated areas, the potential to estimate the population for the whole country. Now, this is not a replacement for census, and it doesn't give us the kind of household detailed information on economics and other things we need for a full census, but it can be absolutely crucial to a country that has missed a census for many years or is just emerging, for example, from situations of conflict. Following the Afghan example, we see a rise in many countries now coming to us and asking if we can, for one portion of the country at least, run model estimates. So that's maybe the hills of Papua New Guinea or Eastern Congo, where there continues to be conflict. So these are really, really important developments that have all been made possible by this sort of geospatial transformation that's taking place. Now, improving the use of data, I mentioned earlier, is one of the things that we've found, I think we can all see in this community, that it really embraces people who may not be interested in tabular data and for whom, looking at lots of charts of data may be Yeah, interesting, but a little bit tedious at times. But to be able to show a snapshot and a visualization and a very clear map of where needs are greater or lesser, where progress is advancing or retreating, we have found that this is absolutely transformational in itself in convincing more governments to invest in these areas of work. So here's a few examples. I told you we work on female genital cutting, often called female genital mutilation. So this shows a map from Kenya. And Kenya has done an amazing job of really decreasing the incidence of female genital cutting over the last couple of decades. But the numbers seem to sort of plateau and persist. And this subnational map made it possible to see that this was really up in the northeast of the country, that there was really this sort of continuing cultural practice of FGM. Likewise, you can see in Ethiopia, it's one thing to have a national aggregate, but to be able to map the subnational differentials has been really, really crucial to investments and response. Likewise, here's some work we've done with the government of Zambia on child marriage. And on the left-hand side, again, like we did for FGM, this is simply a map of the percentage of young women who were married before 18. So that identifies a number of districts where the percentage of child marriage is high. But when you combine that, as we do nicely with the census data, and we look at this on the right-hand side, we can now identify what are the 15 districts in the country where the largest number of girls are at risk of child marriage. Again, tailoring investment and intervention very, very nicely. A slightly more sophisticated example from Malawi, we have the population census on the leftmost map. Then we map all of the service locations. This is for sexual and reproductive health services. That gives us, in the third slide there, the service or the catchment areas. And then in the final map to the right, we ask the question, well, how many people really have access, let's say less than 20 or more than 20 kilometers from what is a high quality antenatal service. And what you see are those areas in dark red where people are living more than 20 kilometers away. And remember, many people are walking or taking public transport. Similar map, this is from South Sudan, where now we hope the peace will be sustained, but lots of interest in contraceptive access. And again, we were mapping travel time to facilities, not just offering one form, but we know choice matters to uptake and to sustained use of family planning. So we asked the question, how many people have access to a facility with at least 3 modern methods of contraception? And regrettably, we find that almost 60% of the adult population has to travel at least 2 hours to find a facility with that level of commodities. And finally, in a nice partnership with Esri very recently, one of our points of response to COVID was to take a lot of the census data and then map for governments in a population vulnerability dashboard how many people, let's say above the 65, were in which locations of a country, and how many people above the age of 80, knowing that older people have been much more at risk to severe consequences. How many people of over 65 were living alone in which locations? And over on the right, what was the readiness of the health sector in terms of its responsiveness and readiness for COVID? All of these have been really, really compelling and exciting our own partners, our donors, and our colleagues about what can be done here. But as Jack very, very nicely made his last and final point, really this is all about building the next generation. And I cannot echo that point most strongly enough. Let's remember that in the Sustainable Development Goals, there was a target that by 2020, not by 2030, but by 2020, the global community was going to really enhance the data capacity and statistical capacity of developing countries, governments, by 2020. And why? Because it was well argued that we need to do that first, so that then there's a decade of action where governments can use those data, use that capacity to track their own progress. But here we are in 2020, and we have a long way to go. I just want to always come back to this map. This is a study that was done published in 2018, and it simply asks, how many researchers are there in the world? It's about, looking at PhD capacity. So if people identify themselves as a PhD researcher per million inhabitants, there are about 1,000 people who can identify themselves per million inhabitants in the world. But that number is 87 in sub-Saharan Africa. It's better, it's 166 in South Asia, almost, just over 400 in Latin America. But what that tells you is that the predominance here is in the global north. It's in East Asia, it's in the countries of Europe, it's in North America. And just remember what these differentials are that we're up against and how much institutional work is needed to build that capacity and research capacity and PhDs in the type of analyses and exciting work that we're talking about today. Our response to that is we have regional offices, 6 regional offices, and we are very, very much focused on that next generation that Jack mentioned. We have a program of population data fellows where we're trying to place young people in different country offices, regional offices, to support this work. That's where we do see the future and the geospatial transformation, not just happening now in this round of census, but actually staying there and remaining to work with governments. I think more Global South collaborating centers would be excellent. Those take more resources, but I think it is really about strengthening the institutions and the next generation in the Global South is where the impact needs to happen. The questions, they keep coming. COVID has raised lots of questions. Many governments asking us, please, let's map schools, which are closed, which are open. Where are we going to have sustained number of young people with long-term access without schools? And that has implications also for food security for young people, many of whom received a meal at school. Can we map that? We have a program on young migrants in transit cities, but if it was difficult for them to progress before COVID, it's more difficult now. Where are they clustering, and how can we deliver services most effectively? Those kind of surveys for both of those, as we know with COVID, are almost all telephone surveys, trying to locate where people are and be able to respond accordingly. And given the interesting spotlight on older persons that's come with COVID, we find many more governments asking, well, let's see if we can map even more closely where older persons may be vulnerable to climate. Let's say women over 65 living alone in poverty in high-risk areas, whether that be from floods or typhoons, etc. So the interest keeps coming. And in some, there's a lot to do. The challenges are really large. The interest and enthusiasm is outpacing our ability to respond. But really, this science of where it underpins much of what UNFPA in our data work is really focused on in this decade of action to 2030. And we welcome the chance to work with many of you as we take this forward. I'll stop there, and I look forward to questions. Thank you, Randall.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Dr. Snow. So we've got a few questions from the audience, and so we'll do right into them. So first off, what do you think the biggest challenge is to getting data today? You mentioned some of the generalization work that you've done in Afghanistan and being asked to do it elsewhere. Is it collection? Is it open data policy? Obstacles? What other issues are you seeing?
Yeah, thanks. I would say, there's a now and then there's also a big now. I would say generally, certainly areas of conflict and humanitarian crisis, absolutely preclude much data collection. We know that that's been a very, very serious issue. Legislation is less an issue, and I think the greater challenge in terms of legislation is that we find more and more governments really don't have what we would call good data policies for the type of modern data we're talking about. So then in anxieties and concerns about privacy, there is also a greater hesitancy to release data and disseminate data. So another parallel line of work, I think, for all of us is helping governments to build that legislative scenarios where they can protect data and find that sweet spot between protecting confidentiality and yet making data accessible. So we can do both, but that does take some technical nice adjustments, but it also takes good data legislation, and that's a really big need in governments. I think the other now problem is COVID. And as I mentioned earlier, we are finding Census is beginning to roll out with, masks for enumerators, all census data collection needing to take outside on the porch, no in the house. But a big challenge here will be that many governments will not want to proceed with census until the pandemic abates. And so there's a lot of discussion about running surveys by telephone, et cetera. But most of this will be simply a delay in the population census round for countries. Over.
Okay, very good. Now, I understand that you are building what you call the population data platform. And without talking to the technology, what is the purpose behind it, and what was the motivation around investments, and finally, how do you see it being used downstream by your consumers and your funders and your country peers and partners?
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, the population data platform is a big initiative for UNFPA, and that's informed by the number of governments we find where even the UN agencies and the governments themselves, if we ask, okay, well, very, very quickly, can you tell us what's the population in District X? Or what does the last projection tell you about the movements of people expected into urban areas 5 years from now? What does the pace look like? And blank spaces for so many of our own UN country offices, and often governments themselves, even though they may have a recent census, not having that sort of instant accessibility to what is the latest and best population data and development data. So it's really with that motivation that we said, listen, we can do this. We need a powerful platform, but we should be able to have the government of Togo click onto their map and go to their own national portal there and quickly look at what the projections of their own population look like at a subnational level. Where are the old people? Where are the young people? Where is child marriage high, as I said, et cetera. So this is really our motivation, and that's been possible already to launch in March with the COVID platform, where we put into that existing public domain census data, and it's been effective. That sort of as a teaser, immediately governments have called up and said, well, wait a minute, we've got more recent data than that. Well, excellent, we're delighted. And then we're now engaging very nicely with a wide range, I think it's about 24 governments right now, to bring up even more recent data that actually hadn't been released into the public domain. So once they see what can happen with those data, and we have certain protections in place, we don't go too high in the resolution in terms of the spatial data, they get excited. And now we see this as really a nice service for more and more governments. To be able to use this platform or link whatever platform they have into this, so that the analytic power in our platform is possible for them as well.
Well, that's excellent. I appreciate you sharing that with us, and I want to thank you for joining us this morning. I know that your time is valuable, but I think laying the groundwork. We believe that census and demographic data is foundational to government and to driving economies, and what you're doing is phenomenal.